What's good, YouTube? It's me, your boy Squiddy, back in another Squid video. Today I want to talk to you guys about how to beat Rescue Ace. Now that Agov has officially dropped, and we actually got an influx of powerful cards that actually support this deck and make it a lot better than ever. That's right, we're talking about these Sinful Spoils cards that are now added into the deck as a micro engine that allows you to leverage a searchable E-Tele in the form of original Sinful Spoils Snake Eye to directly special summon out one level 1 fire monster, aka Fire Hydrant, which starts you off into your plays. And this engine is especially degenerate because it increases the consistency of the deck, but it also increases the explosiveness and the sheer ceiling of the deck because you're now able to play Jet Synchron as the alternative target for original Sinful Spoils, which enables a lot of synchro plays. As you all know, there are a lot of oddly leveled monsters in this deck. For example, Diabellstar the Black Witch, which happens to be a level 7, with a level 1 tuner will give you access to Borreload Savage Dragon, and it's easy to get a Link Karibo or a Link to the graveyard with this deck. And then on top of that, the Turbulence is actually a level 9 for whatever the heck reason, so now you can just make Baron. So this deck's inboard has changed significantly from the last time we talked about this deck, where they, instead of just setting 4, it doesn't stop there, but the madness stopped in addition with 2 bodies, 2 Omni Negates in the form of Baron de Fleur as well as Borreload Savage Dragon, and set 4. So you can kind of see that this deck is now a lot more to be trifled with than ever before. So let's talk about how to beat it, because with YCS Indy coming up on this weekend, I'm sure that a lot of players will be actually playing this deck. In fact, it may or may not be the most popular deck, given by what the deck can actually do. From what I've seen, this deck does a lot. So let's dive in right away and start off with the hand traps at the beginning. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. Now, the one card that you definitely want to Ash Blossom is kind of similar to before, and that is the Emergency card. This deck obviously leverages Emergency by searching it off of their main starter, which is Rescue Ace Airlifter, who happens to be a warrior level 4 monster, and when he's summoned, you get to add Emergency. Activating Emergency will allow them to special summon Fire Hydrant, which can then add a copy of either the Preventer to further their plays, or better yet, the Turbulence, the main man who we already know what he does. He sets 4 different named Rescue Ace cards from your deck to your field directly. So it's like a +4 that, you know, is pretty easy to summon. You just have to banish 2 cards. So this card is actually the card that you definitely want to Ash, the Emergency, except for one case scenario, which I actually thought about, is where the opponent actually starts off with Diabellstar the Black Witch. So, this card says you can special summon it by sending 1 card from your hand or field to the graveyard, and when she's special summoned, you can actually set 1 Sinful Spoils card, spell card, or trap card from your deck to your field. So what that means is they directly set the original Sinful Spoils Snake Eye, they're gonna flip it, and then from there, I would actually Ash, but only in the case where they start off with Black Witch. Why? Because they invest 2 cards. They're using 1 sand off the field or in the hand, and then also the Black Witch technically counts as another card. They're investing 2 cards from their hand to set this original Snake Eye, and the chances of them having a starter is quite slim. There's actually a chance where they're relying on this to actually search Hydrant to actually tap into their Rescue Ace plays. So ashing here is not that bad. At worst, it's a 1-for-1 trade. If they still happen to follow up with Airlifter, it's fine. But the fact that they invested 2 cards means they have 3 cards left in hand, so there's a low possibility of that actually happening. Now, on the other hand, don't get this confused with when the opponent starts off with Wanted, Seeker of the Sinful Spoils, which is a quick play spell card that allows them to add a copy of Diabellstar the Black Witch from their deck to the hand. If they activate this first, and then they use the effect of the Black Witch to set the original Snake Eye, here, I would definitely not Ash because they're only using 1 card. What I mean by that is actually Wanted allows you to banish itself to shuffle back the original Snake Eye from your graveyard to draw a card. So if you Ash here, you're kind of going negative, and there's a good chance that they actually have other cards because they started with Wanted, Seeker of the Sinful Spoil. They have a chance of drawing into the engine if they didn't have it. So in this scenario, you're dealing with 4 cards, whereas in the other scenario where they start with Witch, you're technically dealing with 3. So that's a big difference, you know, the 1 card difference, especially in terms of consistency. Other than that, definitely holding it for the Emergency is correct because Emergency is once per turn, and this is one of the main ways that they actually get access to the missing component for the Rescue Ace combo that they need to get on the board, whether that's the Hydrant or in some other cases just Turbulence to directly go ahead and set 4. Next, let's talk about some other common hand traps. Droll Knockbird, honestly, it's not very good against this deck. There are some cards that add. For example, the cards like the Rescue Ace Hydrant, which allows them to add a card to hand, and also they play Pot of Prosperity. So you can technically cut them off if you're lucky and their hand is kind of mediocre from consecutive adds. But the problem with the Sinful Spoils stuff is, notably, Seeker of the Sinful Spoils quick play is a quick play. So they can activate it and draw step. So you can't play Droll Knockbird because Droll Knockbird cannot be used in the draw step, or they can just chain it on top of your Droll Knockbird after the resolution of a card being added to hand. So if you think about it, it's like, do I really want to go -1 card? And as long as my opponent is smart in playing around Droll Knockbird and can resolve Turbulence to set 4, then it probably means that we're losing because we're down 1 card, right? I mean, there are chances where you actually caught them off guard when they start with something like an Airlifter or a Reinforcement in the army into an Airlifter, like, yeah, sure, or a Pot of Prosperity, but it's a very, very high roller card. There is a heavily good chance that they're still going to be able to mount a board, and anytime they resolve Turbulence through a Droll, you're probably going to lose, especially because you're down a card. So that's why I don't really like Droll Knockbird. Moving on is Nibiru. This card is actually decently good against this deck because the deck does a lot of summoning. I mean, there are a lot of times where they will actually get the Savage Negate on board using the Diabell Star stuff before you can actually use Nib. But the thing is, nowadays, hand traps on their own cannot be used to actually solve or mount a defense. You have to pair them with other hand traps or other board breakers. So when you look at Nibiru with a card that can be combined in tandem with other cards, it gets a lot better. So as long as we have a way to actually bait out the Savage, then we're still getting value out of the Nibiru because this deck always summons more than 5 times. In the alternative, note, if they negate the Nibiru with the Savage, their chances are they're probably equipping the Link Karibo onto the Savage because that's their first Link monster, and they want to get out the Savage before 5 summons to start negating stuff, so they're only going to have 1 counter on the Boral Savage. We're trading the Nibiru for the 1 negate, and then on our turn, that means they're down a negate, so we can use the board breakers to try and mount the comeback alongside Engine. So that's why I actually really like Nibiru, and then when you're going first against this deck, it's one of those decks that are very grindy, and they definitely have to special summon more than 5 times to try and push past your board. It's a lot like when you're playing Cashier in the previous format where going first, having Nib was actually quite devastating. Even though it's a brick turn 1, on the consecutive turn when they try to mount a comeback, it does a lot for you as a defensive option. Next is DD Crow. This card is not very good against this deck for the sheer fact that they don't really rely on their graveyard. You can technically use it against something like a Seeker of the Sinful Spoils trying to draw a card, but it's kind of neg at that point. Sometimes you can get a little lucky when they have exactly 2 Rescue Ace cards in their graveyard and they're trying to summon out Turbulence, so before the Turbulence is able to summon out in the closed game state, you can use DD Crow to banish one of the targets. So if they don't have another way to get a Rescue Ace card in the graveyard, they're not summoning Turbulence. It's kind of a desperation move. I mean, if you're already made decking DD Crow because it has a lot of crossover against the other decks, then sure, I could understand trying to leverage the best of what it does against the deck, but in game 2 and game 3, you shouldn't have to keep it in because it really doesn't do much. There's not a lot of graveyard interaction. There is one thing to note though, Emergency can actually banish itself from the graveyard to target a Rescue Ace trap in the graveyard and set it, and then there are also other cards that are rather niche, like Rescue, that also targets a Rescue Ace monster in their graveyard, so you can get some value out of it, but it's just not a game-breaking card by any means, and it doesn't do well paired with other hand traps or board breakers as for what it does. Dimensional Shifter is actually an insane card, because if you think about it, the key way to beat this deck is to stop them from summoning out Turbulence or resolving Turbulence in setting 4. We can deal with a Borreload Savage Dragon or a Baron. A lot of decks can easily deal with that, but what we cannot deal with is anything backed by set 4. It's just too much advantage. If we're not able to push past all those cards, we're probably losing, right? And Shifter allows you to banish your entire graveyard, which means that Rescue Ace Turbulence is probably not coming out, and Preventor's not coming out either because they have to banish a Rescue Ace card from their graveyard to special summon these monsters, and these are the main meat and potatoes of the deck that allows them to link climb and also get into their powerful boards. And it's just really nice that a lot of the other cards do interact with the graveyard. As you can see, Diabell Star of the Black Witch is actually a cost to send to the graveyard as well, so yeah. And to expand on that a little bit, you might be wondering, why is this a cost? Well, there are no colons in this card, right? You're like, okay, where's the cost at? Well, this card is actually an unclassified monster effect to special summon itself. It's not like the colons that actually activate, but this card does not activate. It's a lot like Cyber Dragon that just hits the board. You know, you summon it from your hand directly, no activated effect, no nada. But it's still a cost. We actually have a preceding ruling with Trap Eater versus Macrocosmos. Trap Eater says you send a trap card from the field to the graveyard to special summon this card from your hand, and then Macrocosmos says all cards are banished. Well, back in the day, the ruling was you cannot summon out Trap Eater by sending for a cost because all cards are banished. So it's the same vein here with Diabell Star of the Black Witch. When Shifter is active, you cannot summon it from the hand. So that's just a key thing to note there. The BYSTIALS are obviously quite dead against this deck because they don't really have any dark monsters, but I know a lot of players are actually main decking BYSTIALS, whether that's in Dragon Link or Tearlaments, just for the level 6 body, in addition to it being decently good against a lot of the other matchups. But there are certain dark materials we can actually hit in the graveyard. For example, if the Rescue Ace player is playing DD Crow, that's one thing that you can hit. And of course, a lot of the Synchro monsters and the Link monsters do have some dark types. So we have Linkuriboh, which is one of the main offenders. If they go summon out Savage, target the Linkuriboh, we actually get some value out of the Bystial Magnemite or whatever the heck Bystial we have here, right? So there is some marginal usage there that you can kind of squeeze in and get some value. But game 2 and game 3, you should definitely take these out because they're just going to be sitting in your hand unless you have your own cards to banish, and they just don't do enough against this deck. So I definitely not recommend them. Then there's Infinite Impermanence, Effect Failure, and also Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill. These cards are decently good against this deck for the sheer fact that they prevent Turbulence from coming out, right? We want to stop Turbulence by all means possible. I generally like holding these cards to the last possible second until you can actually Turbulence, but it does get a little risky now that the Diabell Star stuff is in the deck. So if they start off with this, there is still that small chance that they actually get access to the Borreload Savage Dragon, which starts negating your spell and trap, your infinite impermanences, your effect failures. So you kind of have to juggle. In the same vein of where we were talking about ashing the Sinful Spoils when they start off with Black Witch itself and not actually wanted Seeker of the Spoils, there's probably an argument where we actually Veiler or Imperm Diabell Star of the Black Witch potentially just to try and cut them off the Rescue Ace stuff, but it really depends on the rest of your hand. If you're kind of desperate, I would say you could definitely try that, but generally I still like to hold it for the Turbulence. Now you may argue that, okay, SP Little Knight is a card and this allows them to play around Infinite Impermanence and Veiler. So what you do is when they set up the SP Little Knight and then they drop the Turbulence, you actually have to use the Impermanence or the Effect Veiler there on the spot, and that means that they're not going to be able to chain SP, because if they do, then Turbulence is not resolving because they never activated the effect in the first place, right? There's a closed game state when Turbulence is summoned, but it is a little risky because if there's any other way for them to summon back the Turbulence, then they are going to be able to use the effect because they have not yet activated the effect despite it being once returned. And this is very easy. If they have SP out, they can actually banish the Turbulence and then use something like a Preventer to send the graveyard, and then, you know, boom, they're able to summon back the Turbulence and then use the effect. So it's kind of dicey there, but it's not every day that they're able to actually get a good hand to be able to establish an SP. There are also some players that were testing out Proxy F Magician to still go into the Mud Dragon. Some players are playing Instant Fusion as well to accommodate this, to beat cards that target, like Infinite Impermanence and Effect Veiler. So that's just one thing to note. I mean, they're not crazy against the deck anymore now that they're easily able to set up an SP or a Borreload Savage, but I still think they're good enough when you combine them with other cards. These cards like Imperm also have a great crossover against the other matchups, so as long as you can combine them with other board breakers or hand traps, then you should be relatively decent to play this card in your deck. It's still a solid option. This is one of my fan favorites, but Artifact Lancea, not a lot of players are actually considering this card, but if you think about it from a perspective of what this deck actually wants to do, then you're actually cutting off a lot of their access, because number one, their big monsters like Preventer have to banish to special summon itself out, and then of course Turbulence has to do that to set 4. So if there's not a chance of them actually getting out the Turbulence, then that means they're not going to be able to set 4. Now they may actually have a small chance of actually tribute summoning the Turbulence if they did not use their normal summon to actually try and set 4 through Lancea, but it's still very hard for the deck to do that. Their hand basically has to be exactly how you like it. The nice thing about Lancea is that you shotgun it in main phase, or before main phase rather, so you can play around Pot of Prosperity as well and Triple Tactics Talent. It's really nice that it has that niche utility, and it even stops things like Secret of the Sinful Spoils trying to banish itself to shuffle back and draw. So there are a lot of cool opportunities with this card. In the mid game, you can also stop Emergency from banishing itself to setting one of their traps, and I actually think this card could be a decent card because it hits a lot of other decks too, like Flonderies, potentially Dragon Link, links too. So there are a lot of little crossovers just with Lancea, and with how powerful the pot cards are and how prevalent they are in a lot of decks, this just has a lot of ample crossover in addition to Handing Engine, which I really like. So I would definitely consider Artifact Lancea as a card now. If you haven't seen it already, definitely throw it in your side deck, give it a run. The next card, you guys will not be surprised, but I've been milking this card for its worth for the past little bit. Phantasmay. This card is fantastic against this deck because they play a lot of link monsters. Now, you do have to pair this with other board breakers or non-engine hand traps in order to get maximum value out of Phantasmay, because Phantasmay by itself does not do anything, right? You fix your hand, you scalp it, you put back bricks, and you draw into other cards. That's kind of the power of this card. And you're able to easily draw up to 2 cards, potentially even 3, but generally I think to be safe, you should probably just gun it on the first link monster they make, i.e. a Link Rebo, because the chance of them actually making 2 is not guaranteed, and you definitely don't want to hold Phantasmay until it's too late when they already get Synchro plays and Borreload Savage Dragons or Barons out on the table. But this card, again, does a lot for the deck because it prevents the effect of Baron. You kind of bait and negate if they try to pop it. It's very annoying for this deck to kind of get rid of the Phantasmay, and it's very good on your turn if it survives, because against cards like Extinguish that they set off with Turbulence, you have the ability to potentially try and negate using Phantasmay to bait out another trap card. So it's kind of like a 2-for-1 in addition to fixing your hand and drawing multiple cards. And then this card has a lot of crossover against other decks. You know, there are rogue decks like Marincess. There's, of course, Dragon Link. Unchained plays a lot of Link monsters. There is Rescue Ace. There are a lot of options out there for decks that play Link decks nowadays. It seems like Links are back in action now that Kestur is officially banned. In fact, the only deck that really doesn't play Link monsters is Purely, but even still, they're playing SP Little Knight. Like, best of the best decks right now are playing SP Little Knight. A lot of decks are now incorporating Links, even Tearlaments. So Phantasmay is almost always live. I'm not sure I would main deck it for the sheer fact that it could be potentially dead against decks like Purely still, but it's still a great side deck option. In fact, I would probably side this card in a lot of decks right now for the sheer fact that Links are everywhere, right? So yeah, this card is awesome. Then there's some board breakers. So evenly matched, this deck kind of plays a lot of cards to beat the board breakers, because board breakers are what kind of destroys the deck. Previously, you know, when we didn't have Omni-Negates, but now Rescue Ace has Baron de Fleur, and they also have Borreload Savage Dragon. So are you going to be able to stop those cards? It's not every combo that they actually get these Omni-Negates out. Their hand does have to be quite good, but you know, evenly matched gets a lot better when you actually combine it with other hand traps, so you can bait out the negates and then just crush their board. Alternatively, they can also side Solemn Judgment, so that's another card to watch out for. If you combine evenly matched with something like a Cosmic Cyclone perhaps, and maybe you could snipe it, but I don't like Cosmic Cyclone against this deck because you're kind of like doing too little for stopping the board. But evenly matched, that being said, on its own when combined with other cards can be a huge blowout. So if you are playing this card, you absolutely have to combine it with other hand traps or other board breakers to bait out their negate, and then from there use it evenly so it's actually a high impact card and you're not skipping your battle phase for nada. The same kind of logic goes for Lightning Storm, where, you know, you're clearing their back row. As long as you can pair this with another way to actually bait out the negates, then you're in the clear because you're clearing the back row and you're able to push through their traps without any recursion. By the way, these guys are still setting the same kind of traps. You know, we're still getting the Extinguish set, and we're still getting the other trap in the form of Contain. So those are the two main traps that you have to deal with. There are some players that are actually siding Reinforce now, because this is a great card that plays around board breakers and is also decent in the mirror match because it does a lot in terms of recovery and recursion. It makes it so their monster is unaffected by monsters effects for the rest of the turn, and it also gains 1500 attack and defense, so it becomes a pseudo towers or a Boral and dragon in that sense, you know. And then it also has the effect where you can banish it from your graveyard and target a Rescue Ace spell card in your graveyard to reset it. So it does a lot for one card that you can set directly, and I think that there are a lot of good options with this just for the recovery in the grind game. Other than that, there will be Rescue set as well, so if you're playing a graveyard-based deck like Tearlaments, then remember that Rescue can actually be used as a disruption because it's a quick play spell card that can be resurrected to their side of the field when they can draw Hydrant. So that's just another key thing to note. And then, of course, setting Emergency is one classic thing they love to do, or the Alert, but Alert is generally flipped up on their turn to continue extending their plays. So that was an aside. But, I mean, board breakers are just great if you can combine them with other cards. That's the name of the game currently for the format. You cannot get by with one hand trap or one board breaker. You have to combine it kind of with other cards. Even HARPIE'S Feather Duster is the same logic as Lightning Storm, you know. As long as you have a way of actually crushing the Omni-Negates and the things that prevent you from resolving these cards, resolving them will put you ahead by quite a bit, provided you have the rest of your hand as gas and engine, you know. So that's about all I can say in terms of board breakers. Now, the other last things to note in this deck is they are still kind of playing other cards like Puzzle Mino to modify their levels. So you will actually be dealing with rank 4s like Abyss Dweller if you're playing a graveyard-based deck. So you have to be very, very careful that you account for cards like Abyss Dweller in addition to the Omni Negates. And this deck has mad recursion. So when you drop cards like Nibiru, you have to remember that if they're going for something like a Sunlight Wolf and they have 2 Cyberises on the field, you might want to drop Nib before they can summon out a Decode Talker Heat Soul. So those are just key things to note there. This deck has a lot of utility in their actual extra deck, and of course we can never forget the IP Masquerena in tandem with the SP Little Knight that has now come out and is officially legal as of this weekend when Agov drops. So yeah, that's all I had for the Rescue Ace deck. If you guys have any other things we missed and how to beat this deck or any tech cards, definitely let us know below in the comments. And other than that, we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.